My father-in-law gifted us a car for our wedding, but it turned out to be a financial nightmare when he stopped making payments and blamed us for not handling it right. We got stuck with debt collectors showing up at our door. I had to confront him in front of the whole family, and it's safe to say we're no longer on speaking terms. The car gift had seemed like a dream come true when we first saw it. A sleek dark blue sedan, new enough to look sharp in any driveway, and definitely the kind of thing my husband and I would never have been able to afford ourselves. We'd been married for exactly 2 days when we went out to dinner with his parents, still in that just married glow and not thinking too hard about anything except what lay ahead. My father-in-law had tossed me the keys across the restaurant table and grinned as he said, "Enjoy this wedding present, you two." He knew I hadn't even thought about how we'd get around now that we'd settled down. That car, he said, was a start on our new journey. I should have questioned it. My husband's dad had always been a bit theatrical, often showing off grand gestures, but when it came to following through, the details were usually a bit shaky. A few years back, he promised to send his grandkids to summer camp, offering his credit card to cover it all, only to back out last minute. But at the time, I brushed it aside, chalking it up to his free spirit, and let my husband handle it. So, when he presented the car, I figured he'd planned it all out. After all, he looked so proud, his eyes a bit too bright as he watched us marvel over it. For the first few weeks, it was heaven. I'd never owned anything new like that before, much less something that ran as smoothly as that car did. We would take late-night drives, heading nowhere in particular, just because we could. My husband kept saying how thankful he was to his dad, saying he hoped to pay it back someday with a gift of his own. They'd had a rocky relationship, years of tension that neither one ever addressed directly. But the car seemed like a peace offering, a sign his dad finally saw him as a grown man, not a wayward teenager. For a while, the gift symbolized that shift for us, a new chapter, like we really were building a life together with his family's support. But a few months later, I got the first call from a car finance company, something that seemed like an annoying telemarketing error at first. The guy on the phone told me they'd noticed we hadn't made a payment in months. He was polite, but insistent, as if he had a personal stake in making sure I understood that payments were past due. I was confused, telling him it must be some kind of mistake, and that our car had been paid for as a wedding gift. I remember the quiet chuckle he let out, a mix of amusement and pity, before informing me that there was, in fact, a very open loan attached to the car. The next morning, after a sleepless night of spiraling thoughts, I approached my husband about it. He was just as surprised, though not entirely as devastated as I'd expected. His calm was unsettling, a shrug as if this wasn't news that would affect us both. "I'll call Dad," he assured me. "This has to be some kind of mix-up. He wouldn't do this." But days passed, then weeks, and every time I pressed him about whether he'd spoken with his father, he'd shake his head, say his dad was too busy, or mention some excuse his father had made about it being handled. A month later, I got a letter in the mail, another debt warning, but this time with a glaring red stamp at the top saying "Final Notice." I took it to my husband and watched his face fall, the reality sinking in. "I'll talk to him," he said again, his voice wavering. I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone, calling his dad myself. But when I brought up the car loan, the change in his tone was instant, defensive. "I don't see why you're making such a fuss about this," he said. "It was a gift. I didn't expect you two to turn around and get so high-strung about it." He almost sounded hurt, like I'd insulted him by bringing it up. I bit my lip, counting to 10, trying to keep my voice steady as I said, "We just didn't know there was a loan on it, that's all. We're just trying to sort out the payments." He sighed, an exaggerated put-upon sound. "You know, I really didn't think you'd be this ungrateful. I hand you a car, and this is the thanks I get. Maybe if you handled your finances a bit better, you wouldn't be so worried." I almost dropped the phone. Ungrateful? He wanted to throw that at us after dropping us into a financial trap without a single warning? The final notice flashed through my mind, and I felt a cold determination settle over me. This wasn't a mistake, a simple error that could be fixed with a conversation. It was deliberate. He had given us this gift without any thought of the consequences, leaving us to pick up the pieces. When I hung up, I sat there for a while, letting the anger simmer, thinking about every moment I'd spent with my husband's family, trying so hard to be part of it, to feel like I belonged with them. His dad's words played over in my mind, a loop of accusations and guilt-tripping, and I knew there was no way I'd be able to let this go. After that call, my husband and I tried to ignore the tension in our home. But with every new call from the finance company and every letter that landed in our mailbox, that tension thickened. My husband was torn. He wanted to believe his father hadn't meant any harm, that there was some innocent explanation for all of this. But I could tell he was struggling to keep that hope alive. One day, after another call from the loan company, I made a decision. I'd given my father-in-law the benefit of the doubt for too long, and I was done feeling helpless. I told my husband I'd be visiting his parents alone under the guise of helping with dinner. When I arrived at his parents' house, his dad greeted me as if everything was normal, but I was quick to get to the point. "About the car," I started. His face froze, and I could see his jaw tighten. "Oh, that again," he muttered, looking away like I'd just reminded him of a minor inconvenience. "Yes, that again. You gifted us a car, but there's an unpaid loan attached to it. I need to know why you didn't mention that before. Why would you give us a car without explaining that it wasn't actually paid off?" My voice was sharper than I intended, but I'd held back too much for too long. He chuckled, the sound condescending and cold. "Maybe if you two had your finances in order, you'd have been able to keep up with the payments without so much fuss." "What do you mean by that?" I asked, feeling a chill down my spine. There was something off in his tone, something I couldn't quite place, but I felt that he'd thought this through more than I realized. "Well, let's just say that a wedding gift is a gesture, not a handout. You wanted a car, didn't you? I provided one. The rest is up to you. Maybe it'll teach you both some responsibility." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He hadn't given us a car out of generosity. He'd done it as some twisted lesson in responsibility, but the way he framed it made it sound like it was my husband and me who had failed. He went on to talk about how he'd carried the family financially for years, how my husband should stand on his own 2 feet and stop expecting handouts. Each word felt like a slap. At that moment, I realized this gift had never been about helping us start our lives together. It was a tool, a weapon he could use to manipulate us, especially his son. So I calmly asked, "And what happens if we can't keep up with the payments? Are you prepared to let the car get repossessed, or would that be another lesson?" He shrugged, not even flinching. "If it gets taken, it gets taken. Life's tough. You're adults. Figure it out." I left his house that day seething. This wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about control, about him dangling something in front of us only to pull it away when we needed it most. He wanted us to fail, to show us that we couldn't manage without him, and he'd set the whole thing up perfectly, knowing my husband's trust in him ran deep. Back home, I didn't hold back as I relayed everything he'd said to my husband. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what his father had done, and the pain in his eyes was heartbreaking. He had always wanted his father's approval, to be seen as his own man, and here was his father showing just how little he actually respected him. I wanted to sell the car immediately, to cut all ties with that gift and show his dad that we didn't need his manipulative tactics to survive. But selling a car with a loan wasn't that simple, and the market value didn't even cover the outstanding payments. We were trapped, stuck with this gift that was becoming a nightmare. So we did the only thing we could. We tightened our budget, funneled every spare dollar into making those payments, and found a way to survive without asking for help from anyone, especially his father. But every month, as we scraped by to meet that payment, resentment grew like a shadow over our marriage. One night, my husband broke down, admitting how he felt betrayed. He kept saying, "I just wanted to make him proud." And I knew, at that moment, that his father's plan had worked in more ways than one. We kept pushing through, managing the payments as best we could. But every time we talked about the future, that debt hung over us like a cloud. It was more than just money. It was a reminder that someone who should have supported us had gone out of their way to pull us down. And then, just when we thought things couldn't get worse, another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't just about the car. It was a warning that if we didn't make a balloon payment soon, the car would be repossessed and auctioned. We were cornered, and I could see my husband's spirit breaking as he realized there was no way we could meet that deadline. I knew we needed to act, but going back to his father for help wasn't an option. If we wanted to escape this nightmare, we had to do it on our own terms. Desperation can make you think outside the box, and I was ready to find a way to take control. We couldn't afford the balloon payment, but I wasn't about to let his dad keep pulling the strings. Every time we struggled to make a payment, it felt like he was laughing at us from afar, watching us sink into debt. So I got to work. I researched every angle I could think of, trying to understand the exact terms of the loan and find any loophole we might use. At first, I thought maybe we could refinance, but our credit had taken a hit after struggling with the monthly payments. Then I tried looking into debt settlement, but that wasn't much better. The penalties would eat up any savings we might manage. My frustration grew as I realized how perfectly his father had trapped us. Then, one late night, I stumbled upon something interesting. There was a clause in the loan about repossession that triggered if the car was moved to another state. I hadn't noticed it before because it seemed irrelevant, but the more I thought about it, the more curious I became. Why would a car loan company care if the car crossed state lines, and what did it mean for us? If the car was repossessed out of state, we could negotiate a lower settlement. I mentioned the idea to my husband, half expecting him to laugh at how ridiculous it sounded. But instead, he listened carefully. We both knew it was risky. If it backfired, we could end up even deeper in debt. But if it worked, it could be our ticket out. My husband was hesitant at first. "Are we really going to go through all this? Isn't there another way?" he asked. But I could see the glimmer of hope in his eyes, too. This wasn't just about the money. It was about taking control back from his father. So with a mix of nerves and determination, we hatched a plan. I contacted a friend of mine who lived across the state line and explained our situation. She agreed to let us store the car in her garage for a few weeks, long enough for the repossession process to start. It was a crazy plan, maybe even borderline reckless, but it was the only chance we had to free ourselves from his dad's twisted gift. We arranged to drive the car out to my friend's place under the cover of night. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, as we packed a small bag and slid away. My husband was anxious the whole drive, glancing over at me every few minutes. "Are we doing the right thing?" he kept asking. But I told him, "We're taking back our lives. No one else gets to control us like this." We parked the car in my friend's garage and returned home with a sense of relief. It felt like a weight had been lifted, even though we knew we weren't out of the woods yet. Now it was a waiting game. If the car was repossessed from another state, we'd be able to negotiate from a place of strength, finally putting an end to this nightmare. Days passed, then weeks, and the silence was nerve-wracking. My husband was on edge, worrying about what might happen next. It was time to put our plan into action. I contacted the finance company and laid out our situation. I explained that we couldn't make the balloon payment, but were willing to negotiate a settlement. Surprisingly, they were more understanding than I'd expected. With the car in a different state, they were eager to resolve things quickly, and we managed to negotiate a significantly lower payout. It felt like we were finally catching a break. After the settlement was finalized, I thought about telling my father-in-law. I wanted him to know that we hadn't just rolled over and let him control us, that we'd fought back and won, but my husband stopped me. "Let's keep this to ourselves," he said. "He doesn't deserve to know he got to us. We're done with him." There was a finality in his voice, a determination that I hadn't heard before. With the car nightmare behind us, it felt like we could finally breathe for the first time since our wedding. We didn't owe anything more on the gift that had almost crushed us, and my father-in-law had no more hold on us. But as anyone who's dealt with a controlling person knows, freedom is never really that simple. We were about to find out just how deep his manipulations ran. A month or so after we'd settled with a finance company, my father-in-law called out of the blue. He never called directly, and his voice was filled with a mock warmth that instantly set off alarm bells. He went on about how it had been so long since he'd seen us and how he wanted to get together. Family should stay close, he said, a familiar bitterness creeping into his tone, like he was scolding us for staying away. He had no idea about the car, so I figured he was fishing for information, wondering why we hadn't asked him for more money. My husband was wary but suggested we go, more out of curiosity than anything. He even handed us coffee as we settled into his absurdly perfect living room, and I knew something was coming. There was no way he'd invited us here just to catch up. After a few minutes of forced small talk, he finally leaned in and got to his point. You know, I've been thinking about how I can help you two get ahead, he began, his voice dripping with false generosity. I have an opportunity that I think would really set you up for the future. I glanced at my husband, who looked like he was barely holding back an eye roll. We both knew better by now than to trust anything his father offered, but curiosity kept us listening. The opportunity turned out to be an investment scheme. He wanted us to put our names and our money into a new business venture he was starting. The way he described it, he made it sound like he was doing us a huge favor, offering us a chance to get in on the ground floor of a sure thing. He claimed it was foolproof, that it would give us financial freedom, and that all we had to do was trust him. I didn't want to laugh out loud, but it was hard not to. After what he'd put us through, did he honestly think we'd fall for this? We'd spent months clawing our way out of his so-called gift, and here he was, dangling another opportunity right in front of us. This wasn't about helping us, it was about control, about keeping us tethered to him. I couldn't sit there any longer. I stood up and told him, as calmly as I could, that we wouldn't be participating in any of his schemes. My husband backed me up, and we both made it clear that we were done with the help he kept trying to give. His face fell, but I could see the anger simmering beneath his practiced smile. For a moment, he looked like he was going to snap, but then he just sat back and watched us, his gaze cold and calculating. When we left his house, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We'd finally said no to him, but I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. He'd been trying to control us for too long to let go that easily. Sure enough, over the next few weeks, he sent messages and tried to lure us back in, but we ignored him. We kept our distance, and it felt liberating. Then, about a month later, I got a call from a lawyer. It turned out that my father-in-law had filed a lawsuit against us, claiming that we'd damaged his property, specifically the car that we'd left across state lines. He argued that by moving it, we'd violated our contract with him and owed him damages. It was absurd, but he'd twisted the situation to make it look like we were at fault. He wasn't just trying to control us, he was actively seeking to hurt us now. The lawsuit sent me reeling. My husband was furious, pacing around the house and muttering about how his dad would go to any length to ruin our lives. But I wasn't going to let him win this time. I got in touch with a finance company and explained what was happening. Luckily, they agreed to provide documentation that showed the loan was settled legally and that my father-in-law had no claim to any damages. We gathered every piece of evidence we could find and prepared to fight him in court. When the hearing came, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I realized that he could no longer manipulate us. His power over us was gone. He'd tried to trap us with debt, but we'd broken free. Now he was the one scrambling, trying to regain control in whatever desperate way he could. In the end, the judge dismissed his case, seeing right through his flimsy arguments. The relief was overwhelming, and for the first time I felt a real sense of closure. I knew he'd never stop trying to control us in some way, but we'd found a strength I didn't know we had. We'd survived his gift, his schemes, and even his attempts to punish us for breaking free. That day I realized that his power only existed as long as we let it.